Proceed.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to add my voice to those in support of this budget presented by my honorable colleague, the Senior Minister in the Office of the President with responsibility for finance under the theme Economic Dynamism and Resilience. Mr. Speaker, before I deal with the substance of the budget measures, I wish to confront something that I warned against in my maiden presentation to this House during the 2020 budget debate. Mr. Speaker, I speak about the incessant radicalizing and racializing of the policy debate by some members on the other side of this House. Mr. Speaker, the connections of my family to the People's National Congress are well known. Yet, the leaders of the PPC, when considering their government and what their government would look like and who would have a say in defining and implementing its policies, chose me, despite the political connections of my family, and despite the fact that I had never before even dreamed of being involved in politics. Mr. Speaker, this speaks to the core and the DNA of a president and a party and a philosophy that cannot credibly be held out as racist and non-inclusive. And this is not just window dressing, Mr. Speaker. Take a look at the portfolios that has been assigned to those of whom the opposition would dismiss as tokens. Labor, accounting for hundreds of thousands
Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry, Minister Oneidge, but I think we've had enough of Mr. Duncan's
Honorable
accusing members of this House in the most disrespectful manner.
Honorable member.
He cannot be allowed,
Honorable
Mr. Speaker,
member,
to continue in this
I
manner.
don't see the point of order. Mr. Duncan, I didn't hear him. He wasn't on his feet. But I want to again caution members about the comments. Thank you.
It goes both ways, Mr. Speaker, then. It will go both ways.
Honorable Minister Walrond.
I want you to return the chronicle money that you took, talking about being dishonest. Yes. Never before was I ever accused of taking anybody's money. Mr. Speaker, take a look at the portfolios that have been assigned to those of whom the opposition would dismiss as tokens. Labor, accounting for hundreds.
Sir, on a point of order.
Honorable Minister, Honorable Member, Mr.
Sir, Standing Order 45D. I recognize that the Honorable...
No. What is the standing order and the point you're making?
45D.
Yes.
And I've recognized that the Honorable Member Charles Ramsden is out of his seat and is behaving in a manner that is very much not fit and proper, sir.
Honorable Member, that's not a point of order. A point of order is the person standing in the passageway who's been violating the sanctity of the assembly. You either take a seat, sir. The person who is to the western end of the auditorium. Honorable Minister, I'll give you back your 1 minute that has been lost.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I repeat, and this is not just window dressing. Take a look at the portfolios that have been assigned to those of whom the opposition would dismiss as tokens. Labor, accounting for hundreds of thousands of employees and their rights. Foreign affairs, home affairs, the portfolios of any energy generation, telecommunications, civil defense, and others assigned to the office of the Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, people can examine for themselves how portfolios were assigned under the AP and new AFC government. I don't have to delve into their record. It is there and it speaks for itself. Suffice it to say, Mr. Speaker, as a person new to politics, my own responsibilities are far in excess of those that the previous administration sought to confer, even on their Prime Minister. And people noticed. I wish to turn to another term that some members on the other side are throwing around with reckless disregard for the social cohesion for which they profess to embrace. That term, Mr. Speaker, is ethnic cleansing. Mr. Speaker, as you know, this term was coined from the unspeakable brutality of the Balkan Wars of the 90s, where over 100,000 persons were killed and over 1 million people were forcibly removed from their homes using devices such as threats of rape, torture, sexual assault, and deportation, among others. This is the history of the term that is now so recklessly trivialized by those on the other side in their pursuit to gain political advantage. Shameful. The members on the other side have doubled down with chants of ethnic cleansing with respect to separations in the public sector. And I want to confront this, Mr. Speaker. Since I've had the privilege of serving in the public sector, and I think I know what is expected of us therein, Mr. Speaker, I want to remind you that in the heady days after the 2015 election, Guyanese were promised a neutral and professional public service. That was the promise, Mr. Speaker. But what did we in fact get? Mr. Speaker, in the aftermath of the election of 2020, several persons in the public sector openly indicated that they were adamantly opposed under any circumstances to President Ali and to any PPP government. They openly said so. Some took to social media, some took to the mainstream press, some even took to the streets. Some of these public servants were captured on camera praying and referring to anyone outside of their chosen political circles as devils. Some said that the PPPC were rigging the elections. Others said that any PPPC administration would be illegitimate under any circumstances. Some of these public servants even said they had no intention nor inclination to work with a PPPC government. These sentiments were not hidden, Mr. Speaker. They were openly and bluntly expressed, and in some cases, unrelenting in their frequency. Then, Mr. Speaker, after 5 long months during which very people were encouraged and emboldened and ultimately abandoned by those now on the other side, after some of those very public servants who were educated enough, they were old enough and senior enough to know better, stepped squarely into the political affray. And instead of doing the right thing and resigning, they continue to occupy office.
Honorable Minister, but you did say your side. And again, I'm involved.
I do apologize, Mr. Speaker. But that was not the real problem, Mr. Speaker. The real problem was that having opted to remain in office, some were not content to buckle down and do the job. Many were determined to be obstructionists and engaged in behavior that could not reasonably be interpreted as anything other than obstruction, given their stated sentiments. Some came to this very house, Mr. Speaker, and refused to assist in providing information in response to questions asked during consideration of the estimates by the people's representatives on the other side themselves. Some of these public servants were observed celebrating their obstruction in the precincts within which this honorable house meets. Mr. Speaker, that is the half that has never been told. Mr. Speaker, the budget that is presented by my honorable colleague, like any other budget, represents the implementation of the policies of a government. And what choice does a government which is determined to deliver a program for the people have, but to part ways with those who resolutely and demonstrably oppose to the government itself, regardless of its programs, to point that some of them demonstrate, to the point where some of them demonstrate a willingness to obstruct that administration? How could such people be relied on to carry out or implement an agenda they themselves openly profess to be against? Mr. Speaker, let me make this clear. I am not saying that all persons separated from the public service were obstructionists. This is not the case. I say, however, Mr. Speaker, that when the opposition takes to social media and lumps the good and the bad and the ugly in their quest to pursue a narrative of racial discrimination, they do so at a disservice to those who are separated from the public service with dignity and with no wish other than to give the administration space or to pursue other opportunities, as some of them indeed did. Mr. Speaker, I am personally aware of some who did so. The record is there, Mr. Speaker. Many of these people had to take to social media to refute allegations of the opposition of circumstances of their termination and had to publicly request to be disassociated from the reckless race mongering that was being pursued. Mr. Speaker, I know that many of the honorable members on the other side know these things. But our friends on the other side, having nothing else to sell to their supporters, have typically descended into full hyperbole and accused the government of ethnic cleansing. And they didn't use that term when they fired over 1,500 indigenous workers from the CSO program or sent home thousands of sugar workers within 1 week of taking office in 2015. That was not ethnic cleansing then. It appears, Mr. Speaker, that these are the only goods our colleagues have to sell, and I will tell you why. Mr. Speaker, on February the 12th, 2020, a mere 2 weeks before the 2020 elections, the former Minister of Business, the Honorable Member, Mr. Raj Kumar, launched, in air quotes, the Belvedere Business Incubator. There was a grand opening ceremony, a ribbon was cut, photographs were taken, speeches were given, and news articles were written. But, Mr. Speaker, listen to the reality. The Belvedere Incubator, which the Honorable Member claimed to have launched, had no equipment. The 6 pods were all unoccupied. The incubator had no manager or staff, and worst of all, Mr. Speaker, the building was without electricity. However, there was a ceremony saying that the incubator was launched. If this is your record, Mr. Speaker, it is not hard to see why the only thing you can bring to the people is to accuse the government of being racist. Mr. Speaker, today I am pleased to report that in November 2020, electricity was restored to the Belvedere Business Incubator. All of the relevant equipment was procured and will be delivered to sites shortly. We will then be able to truly and fully operationalize the incubator in a matter of months, and its facilities will be made available on an equitable, non-discriminatory basis in an open and transparent manner. We estimate that around 120 jobs will be created through the projects that will utilize these facilities. Mr. Speaker, I then give you another example, the Lethem Industrial Estate. On March 14th, 2019, the then Minister of Business, Mr. Gaskin, hosted a media tour of the Lethem Industrial Estate. A Department of Public Information article was published with the headline, Lethem Industrial Estate for May Completion. The article went on to say, and I begin quote, according to the Minister of Business, Dominique Gaskin, the media tour was organized because the facility is close to completion, and the ministry wants to be transparent with information which relates to the application process through which persons can acquire rights to use the facility, which will begin shortly, end quote. So what was and is the state of affairs, Mr. Speaker? Allow me, Mr. Speaker, to quote the Auditor General on this project. On page 122, paragraph 272 of the Auditor General's report for the fiscal year 2016, the following is stated regarding that estate, the Lethem Industrial Estate. I begin quote, as a result of poor supervision of the works, various sections of the finished road surface were not completed to the required thickness as per contract, and the carriageway and shoulders. Our physical verification revealed that the thickness of the finished asphalt layer was inconsistent, with variances ranging from the areas where the asphalt layer was spread very thin and the subbase of the road could be seen through the aggregate in the asphalt mix. End quote. Moving on to 2019, Mr. Speaker, paragraph 169 of and page 213 of the said audit report states in respect to the same Lethem estate, Mr. Speaker, I begin quote, a physical verification on the 29th of July 2019 revealed that the works were incomplete and the completion date for the works expired on May 2019. This report also mentioned, I begin quote, as outlined in the 2019 capital project profile, the benefits of the project were to improve infrastructure for business development. Hence, the delayed implementation of the program's activities may lead to the intended benefits of the program not being achieved as planned. End quote. There you have it, Mr. Speaker. Not in my words, but in the words of the Auditor General, an unbiased and non-partisan opinion on the stewardship of our friends on the other side, Mr. Speaker. Once again, considering the record of this administration, it is not surprising that their game plan is to scream race at every move we make. Mr. Speaker, it gives me no pleasure to say it, because it is the citizens of Region 9 who ultimately suffer. But when we took office in 2020, the Lethem estate had no lessee, the construction works were still incomplete, and not a single piece of equipment that was needed had been procured. Mr. Speaker, as a government, we commit to ensuring that the intended benefits of the estates are achieved. That is, improved infrastructure for business in order to spur economic development and job creation. That is why in Budget 2020, we have allocated $100 million for the procurement of equipment to operationalize and furnish the Lethem incubator. Since taking office, we have continuously engaged the contractor of the Lethem Industrial Estate, developing a no-nonsense, no-excuses policy. Moreover, an expression of interest for the leasing of lots of the estate were already published, applications received, and they're currently under review. We will soon see the Lethem Industrial Estate and the incubator serving its intended purpose, and all Guyanese, without regard to class, gender, orientation, or whatever lines they may come up to divide us, will have a fair opportunity from this inclusive government to benefit. Mr. Speaker, I will not dwell on these policy failures, for they could take up my entire time allotment. I wish to therefore look forward and examine some of the measures that we are implementing, which will demonstrate the inclusive development philosophy of this government. With respect to industrial development, Mr. Speaker, in 2021, we will commence feasibility studies for suitable industrial estates in regions 2 and 10. These additional sites and their associated projects will provide scores of good-paying jobs to the people of these regions, thus improving their standard of living. Mr. Speaker, in the selection in particular of Region 10, you can see that we are not concerned with who one might have voted for. Our mandate is to deliver development across the board. Tell me, where is the discrimination and racism there? Mr. Speaker, we view the construction sector as critical in building Guyana. We have been concerned about the high cost of building, not only to businesses, but ordinary Guyanese seeking to build or improve their homes. To bolster the sector, in 2020, we removed the 14% value-added tax on several construction materials. In Budget 2021, we are proposing to extend the zero-rated status until further notice for stone imported from CARICOM. We are also removing VAT from locally produced pre-stressed concrete piles, locally fabricated mild steel beams, and locally manufactured roofing, together with PVC products for building construction. Mr. Speaker, in making construction cheaper, we have not done it for people in Region 6, or Region 3, or Region 2 alone. It affects, its effects will be felt across the board in every region. So where, I ask, is the discrimination in that? Mr. Speaker, in regard to registering a business, we understand that the plight of our citizens in many regions outside the Demerara Mahaica area. Among other things, they lack a commercial registry or sub-office, and thus find great difficulty in registering their business or renewing their registration. In the past, they would have to travel at great cost in time and money to Georgetown and to have the relevant processes completed. To alleviate the burdens on the businessmen and women and to ensure that their business in these regions do not fall into the informal economy, the Ministry of Tourism, Industry and Commerce set up several registration hubs in regions 6, 8, and 9, and more recently in regions 1 and 7 through the signing of an MOU with the commercial registry. Already, Mr. Speakers, hundreds of businesses from these regions have benefited from this convenience. And once again, Mr. Speaker, you can see how our programs are designed to benefit all Guyanese. Moreover, as a ministry, we are committing to explore other avenues to ensure that there is a seamless process for registering business. And I will spend some time on that topic a little later. In relation to business support, Mr. Speaker, former Minister Mr. Gaskin is quoted in this House as saying, I begin quote, our government, referring to the AP and UAFC, is committed to the development of a sustainable and successful small business sector and will ensure that small operators are given a space in the public procurement pipeline, close quote. Mr. Speaker, what was the reality? The reality is that the administration reduced the ceiling for small business grants, reducing the amount by 60%, from $500,000 to $200,000. Mr. Speaker, the most cited concern for such small businesses is their ability to access finance, with high rejection rates from commercial banks and other lending agencies. So how can someone commit to the development of a sustainable and successful business sector whilst reducing their access to finance? Mr. Speaker, let me remind you and the members of this honorable House that in October 2020, our administration made a decision to restore the ceiling to a level that can be truly beneficial to small business, and small businesses can once again receive up to $500,000 in grant funding from the Small Business Development Fund to expand their operations or assist with startups. But, Mr. Speaker, restoring the ceiling is not the only thing we have done for small businesses. We have also, through the allocations in this budget, increased the total envelope available to $250 million, thereby expanding the amount of support for that sector. Mr. Speaker, on this note, permit me to briefly respond to the first speaker in these debates, my learned friend, the Honorable Member Amanza Walton Desir, who described our allocation to the Small Business Development Fund as paltry. Mr. Speaker, I remind this House, including my honorable friend Walton Desir, that in 5 consecutive AP and UAFC budgets, the most that was ever allocated to the fund at any juncture was $100 million. Contrast that, Mr. Speaker, with the fact that in a mere 6 months of our administration, we have already allocated $350 million to the fund. The people of Guyana can certainly decide which allocations were paltry and which allocations are substantial. Mr. Speaker, on a final note regarding, on record regarding small businesses, as you know, the Procurement Act requires that all procuring entities produce a procurement plan within 3 weeks of the passage of the budget. Mr. Speaker, you may recall that just a few weeks ago, this House passed an amendment to the Small Business Act that tightened the definition of a small business in order to level the playing field and critically allowed for 20% of government procurement in the area of works to be set aside for small businesses. On the passage of this budget, we will now finally have the framework through which the set-offs can be included in the procurement plans. And that, Mr. Speaker, is an initiative which ought to be supported by all members of this honorable House. This year, Mr. Speaker, we are finally poised to see small businesses truly benefit from this critical facility. And I urge the members of the other side to persuade the constituents to take advantage of these facilities of the Small Business Bureau, where Guyanese of all persuasion with a viable business plan are welcome. Barbershops too. Tourism development and support. Mr. Speaker, I will now turn my attention to the tourism sector, a sector which has long been integral to the Guyanese economy. Before I report to you, Mr. Speaker, some of our initiatives, allow me to answer one criticism which we appear to be hearing from the APNU-AFC. And it is a criticism which I believe to be alarming for its lack of vision. It has been heard said from the former finance minister, Mr. Jordan, and seems to be embraced by some members on the other side, honorable members of the other side. And that criticism, Mr. Speaker, is that we are building hotels when no one is traveling. Mr. Speaker, I find that particular criticism alarming because it appears as though some of us are afraid to dream big dreams for Guyana. It appears as though they would forever have us remain a poor and an impoverished nation, hewers of wood and drawers of water. Mr. Speaker, Guyana is one of the hottest destinations on planet Earth right now. The fact is that even in the midst of the pandemic, our higher-end hotels do not even have enough rooms. Mr. Speaker, we cannot wait until the demand is realized to start building the hotels. We are not talking about haberdashery or sweetie, that we could just go around the corner and purchase 2,000 hotel rooms and walk out with them. These things take years, from mobilizing of financing to construction and finishing. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, what is required is vision, foresight, and the ability to see beyond the horizon in order to plan for a bright future for all. An example of this vision, Mr. Speaker, was the original conception of our ecotourism product. Mr. Speaker, I am advised that way back in 2013, almost a decade ago, under a project secured by the Ramatar administration, the Rewa Eco Lodge was built, and Rewa Village established a catch and release program that provided much needed jobs to secure the livelihoods of many in that community, and helped to stem a wave of outward migration that was threatening the very existence of that village. It is initiatives born out of visions like these that eventually resulted in Guyana being adjudged the #1 ecotourism destination in the world. But I dare say, Mr. Speaker, had our honorable friends been in government in 2013, with the potential of ecotourism requiring foresight, no such investment in our future might have been made. So, Mr. Speaker, I urge my honorable colleagues not to be lost in time, in that time where we were described as the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. We, the PPPC government, dream of being the richest country in the world, if not in dollars, certainly in the quality of life of all our citizens. Mr. Speaker, it has been almost 1 year since the world tourism sector was ravaged by the restrictive measures necessary to contain the COVID-19 virus. Despite this ever-present threat, Mr. Speaker, I am happy to report that Tourism Guyana is showing signs of revitalization due to the measures that our government have taken to responsibly recover from the pandemic. Mr. Speaker, our government inherited a sector that was devastated by the effects of the coronavirus pandemic. Revenue had plummeted by almost 50%. Thousands were left unemployed or on paid leave, and businesses were unable to manage operational costs. It appeared at that time that the AP and AFC government were uncertain of what strategic intervention was required to ensure the sustainability and recovery of the sector. However, we were not daunted by the magnitude of the pandemic. Being cognizant of the fact that thousands of Guyanese and their families depend on this sector for their well-being, our administration was proactive. 6 months later, I can state categorically that Guyana's tourism is on the road to recovery and undoubtedly will make a full recovery in time to come. Mr. Speaker, we are clear in our approach to the recovery of the sector. First, there was a need to ensure the safety of our tourism workers and their families. To do this, employees within the tourism sector needed to be adequately trained in preparation for the reopening of the sector. Training was thus conducted across the country, and as Minister responsible for tourism, I am confident that we are much more prepared to safely welcome visitors to our tourism destinations. Speaking of training, Mr. Speaker, more than 30 million has been allocated in Budget 2020 for training within the tourism sector. This will better position us to keep abreast with evolving trends within the sector and ensure that we meet the increasing expectation of our guests. In this regard, sir, I would mention that this Budget 2021 provides an allocation of 185 million for the establishment of a tourism and hospitality institute, which will provide much needed instruction to persons who wish to pursue a career in the industry. Mr. Speaker, our efforts did not stop there. The Guyana Tourism Authority has been working closely with stakeholders to ensure the implementation of the health and sanitization protocols, which are prerequisites for receiving conditional approval from the COVID task force for safe
Honorable
reopening.
Minister, your efforts may stop here if you don't get an extension.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask for 5 minutes extension. My colleague to conclude.
Thank you, Honorable Minister. Honorable Minister of Tourism, Industry and Commerce, you may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In direct support to our Amerindian communities and stakeholders within the tourism sector, the Ministry of Tourism, Industry and Commerce embarked on a distribution of sanitization supplies with the objective of equipping those directly involved with the necessary tools to ensure their safety. Mr. Speaker, in 2020, approximately 47 million was spent on preparedness for 39 Amerindian communities in regions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, and 9. Another 12 million will be spent in 2021 to support 10 more communities with their recovery plans as tourism reopens to the international market. This is part of our direct intervention, one built of empathy, concern, and foresight. A decision premised on the fact that the first step to recovery was to determine a way to remain safe. Our second approach to recovery, Mr. Speaker, was to target and develop domestic tourism. This plan is delivered through the strong working relationship the ministry has developed with regional tourism bodies. Regional tourism committees and other stakeholders were encouraged to develop niches within their respective communities, and we began a campaign to encourage Guyanese to explore various areas across the country while adhering to COVID-19 guidelines. This initiative breathed life into the sector as Guyanese responded and began to travel. Mr. Speaker, as you know, it has been the cry of many Guyanese that local travel can be expensive. In direct response, we have removed value-added tax from hinterland travel, making it more affordable for average Guyanese to experience the beauty and splendor of our country. Mr. Speaker, building an economy that is dynamic and resilient requires us to make Guyana easier to do business. It requires modernization through the use of technology and innovation, and it requires policies that encourage businesses to invest. With these requirements in mind, Mr. Speaker, I turn to some of our transformative plans, policies, and programs that we intend to pursue for private sector development and growth. Mr. Speaker, we have Guyana, as you know, is ranked 151 out of 190 nations and territories for trading across borders. But, Mr. Speaker, I want it to be clear, we do not propose to be slaves to the rankings, which in many respects are not suited to our realities. But, Mr. Speaker, there is no denying that we must reduce the costs and time associated with trade across borders if our local businesses are to compete in regional and global markets. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, the electronic single window system for trade has long been recognized as one of those key transformative projects which will radically reduce time and cost for conducting business. Mr. Speaker, last year we've allocated $10 million to complete reviews to facilitate implementation. For 2021, we have budgeted $135 million, with which we will be procuring the goods and services, and by the end of the year, implementation of the Single Windows project will be well advanced, such that in 2022, we will be closer to completion of this initiative. Mr. Speaker, with all of the initiatives that I have outlined in this presentation, I put it to you that our friends on the other side cannot credibly contend that this budget lacks vision and delivers nothing for the people of Guyana. Quite contrary, Mr. Speaker, what we see is a coherent and coordinated set of programs which place us on a firm trajectory of inclusive and sustainable growth and development. And if our honorable friends on the other side are honest with themselves, they would agree and support the measures in this budget. Mr. Speaker, I thank you.